He thought humiliating her in front of hundreds of people would make him unforgettable, but in less than a minute, he would wish no one remembered his name at all. The studio lights burned bright across the polished stage, casting long reflections over the glossy black floor as Daniel Whitmore stood at center frame, perfectly composed in his tailored navy suit, his voice smooth and commanding as it carried across the packed auditorium. The audience leaned forward in their seats, drawn in by his confidence, by the promise of another sharp, entertaining moment that had made his show one of the highest rated in the country. Cameras glided silently along their tracks, red lights blinking, capturing every expression, every reaction, every shift in tone. And then, almost as an afterthought, his gaze drifted past the front rows and settled on someone most people hadn't even noticed. Emma Carter sat quietly near the aisle, her hands folded neatly in her lap, wearing a simple gray cardigan and modest slacks, the kind of outfit that seemed to disappear under the weight of flashing lights and designer suits around her. She hadn't come to be seen. She hadn't come to speak. But something about her stillness caught his attention, and in Daniel Whitmore's world, attention was never accidental. It was opportunity. A slow smile curled at the edge of his lips as he paused mid-sentence, tilting his head just slightly, the way he always did when he was about to turn an ordinary moment into something unforgettable. "You there," he said, gesturing casually toward her with a flick of his hand, his tone light but unmistakably pointed. "You look like you've got something on your mind." A ripple of laughter moved through the audience, soft at first, then growing as heads turned, eyes locking onto Emma, as if she had suddenly stepped under a spotlight she never asked for. For a moment, she didn't move. Her posture remained calm, her expression unreadable, as if she were deciding whether this moment deserved her energy at all. But the cameras had already found her. The room had already chosen her. And Daniel, sensing the shift, pressed further. "Come on," he added, his voice carrying a playful edge that masked something sharper underneath. "Don't be shy. We love hearing from unexpected voices." The phrase landed with just enough emphasis to draw another wave of amusement, subtle but deliberate, the kind that made the target feel smaller without anyone quite admitting it out loud. Emma rose slowly, smoothing her sleeve with a quiet, almost practiced motion, and stepped into the aisle. Each footstep echoed faintly against the floor, a soft contrast to the growing anticipation humming through the room. As she approached the stage, the lights seemed harsher, the space wider, the silence stretching just a fraction longer than comfortable. Daniel watched her with the same confident ease, already certain of how this would unfold, already imagining the clip, the reaction, the viral moment. He leaned slightly toward the microphone, lowering his voice just enough to draw the audience in. "Tell us," he said, his eyes narrowing with curiosity that wasn't entirely kind. "What exactly do you think you can add to this conversation?" And for the briefest second, as Emma lifted her gaze to meet his, something shifted. Not in the room, not in the crowd, but in the space between them. Her eyes steady, unhurried, the kind of calm that didn't ask for permission, the kind that didn't need approval. And though no one realized it yet, not even Daniel himself, the moment he had been waiting to control had already begun to slip quietly out of his hands. Emma Carter stopped just a few feet from the stage, the edge of the platform rising in front of her like a quiet boundary between two very different worlds. And for a brief moment the room seemed to hold its breath as Daniel Whitmore studied her more closely, his expression sharpening with interest as if he had just found something unexpectedly entertaining, something he could shape, control, and present however he pleased. And with a small, inviting gesture that felt more like a command than an offer, he motioned for her to step up beside him, the audience watching with growing curiosity as she complied without hesitation, her movements calm, deliberate, almost detached from the energy swirling around her. And when she reached his side, the lights intensified, reflecting off the polished floor and illuminating every subtle detail, every flicker of expression, every shift in posture. And Daniel turned slightly toward her, one hand resting casually on the podium as he angled his body toward the crowd, already framing the narrative in his favor. "So tell us, Emma," he began, his voice smooth but edged with a quiet condescension that was easy to miss if you were not paying attention. "What brings you here tonight? Because I have to admit, You do not exactly look like someone who usually participates in conversations like this." A soft wave of laughter rolled through the audience, not loud enough to feel cruel, but pointed enough to land exactly where it was intended, and Emma did not react immediately, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged, as though she were allowing the moment to fully unfold. Before deciding how to respond, and Daniel leaned in just slightly, sensing hesitation where there was none, mistaking silence for uncertainty. "Do not worry," he added, his tone lightening just enough to keep the crowd engaged. "We keep things simple here, nothing too complicated." Another ripple of amusement spread, cameras tightening their focus, capturing her face, waiting for discomfort, waiting for the reaction they had been trained to expect. But instead, Emma simply nodded once, a small, composed gesture that carried none of the tension Daniel anticipated. "I am here because I was invited," she said quietly, her voice clear despite its softness. And something about the way she spoke caused a subtle shift in the room, not enough to break the atmosphere, but enough to register, like a faint change in temperature that no one could quite explain. Daniel smiled, though it tightened slightly at the edges. "Invited," he repeated, as if testing the word for weakness. "That is interesting, because this event is typically reserved for individuals with, let us say, a certain level of experience." He paused just long enough for the implication to settle, for the audience to connect the dots he had so carefully arranged. "So I have to ask, what exactly qualifies you to be part of this discussion?" The question hung in the air, sharpened by expectation, and for a moment there was nothing. No movement, no sound beyond the faint hum of studio equipment and the quiet shifting of the audience in their seats. And then Emma lifted her gaze fully to meet his, not with defiance, not with hesitation, but with a kind of steady clarity that did not seek approval. "That depends," she replied, her tone even, measured, "on what you believe qualifies someone." And the simplicity of her answer landed differently than expected, not dramatic, not confrontational, but precise, like a question that quietly turned itself back on the person who asked it. And for the first time, Daniel's smile faltered just slightly, almost imperceptible, as though something small but important had slipped outside of his control. And somewhere in the room, the laughter did not come as easily as before, replaced instead by a brief, uncertain silence that lingered just a fraction longer than comfortable. Daniel Whitmore let out a soft chuckle, the kind that usually signaled control, the kind that told the audience everything was still part of the show, still within his grasp. But there was a slight delay this time, a fraction of a second where his expression did not quite match the rhythm he was known for, and he quickly recovered, turning slightly toward the crowd as if inviting them back into the moment. "That is a thoughtful way to avoid the question," he said, his tone light, but edged again, with that familiar condescension. "But let me make it easier for you," he continued, shifting his weight and resting one hand casually on the podium. "This conversation tonight is about complex decision-making, about strategy, about high-level thinking that usually requires years of experience. So I will ask you again, what exactly qualifies you to stand here and speak on it?" The audience leaned in, some smiling, some waiting, the earlier laughter now replaced with a quieter anticipation, as if they were expecting the moment to tip back into entertainment at any second. And Daniel, sensing the need to regain full momentum, added with a slight tilt of his head, "Unless, of course, you are just here to observe." The implication landed clearly this time, sharper, more deliberate, and a few scattered laughs followed, though not as strong as before, and Emma remained still for a moment, her hands relaxed at her sides, her posture steady under the intensity of the lights. And when she finally spoke, her voice did not rise, did not rush, but carried with a clarity that seemed to travel further than expected. "You are assuming that experience only looks one way," she said, her eyes meeting his without hesitation, and Daniel smiled again, though this time it felt practiced. "Well, experience tends to leave visible traces," he replied, gesturing lightly toward her outfit without naming it directly. The message unmistakable, and a murmur moved through the audience, subtle but present, and Emma followed his gesture briefly, then looked back at him, her expression unchanged. "Sometimes it does," she answered, "and sometimes it does not need to." There was a pause, small but noticeable, as if the air itself hesitated, and Daniel shifted slightly, adjusting his stance. "All right," he said, his tone tightening just a fraction. "Then let us try something more concrete." He turned toward the large screen behind them, signaling to the production team with a quick glance, and within seconds the display lit up with a complex scenario, numbers, projections, layered data points designed to challenge even seasoned professionals, the kind of problem that had been discussed earlier in the evening by industry experts. And Daniel gestured toward it with confidence. "Since you believe qualifications can be invisible," he said, turning back to her, "why do not you walk us through how you would approach this?" The audience reacted immediately, a mix of curiosity and expectation returning, some leaning forward, others exchanging knowing looks, as if they were about to witness the moment where uncertainty would finally reveal itself. And Daniel stepped slightly aside, giving her space but also framing the challenge, controlling the narrative even in his apparent generosity. "Take your time," he added, though the tone suggested the opposite. And for a brief moment, Emma looked at the screen, her eyes scanning the information, the numbers, the structure, and then something subtle shifted. Not outwardly dramatic, not something most people would notice at first, but her focus sharpened, her posture aligning with a quiet precision that contrasted with everything Daniel had assumed about her. And as the room settled into a deeper silence, waiting, watching, expecting hesitation, she reached for the marker placed on the podium, her movement calm, unhurried, and in that instant, without a single raised voice or dramatic gesture, the balance in the room began to change, though no one was ready to admit it yet. The marker rested lightly between Emma Carter's fingers as she stepped closer to the display, her gaze fixed on the complex web of numbers and projections, and for a brief moment, the room seemed suspended in quiet anticipation, the kind of silence that carried expectation rather than respect, as if everyone was waiting for hesitation to appear, for uncertainty to confirm what they already believed. And Daniel Whitmore stood just behind her, arms loosely folded, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp, watching closely, confident that the outcome would unfold exactly as he intended. But Emma did not rush. She did not fill the silence with nervous words or unnecessary explanations. Instead, she studied the structure, her eyes moving steadily across the data as if she had seen something like this many times before. And then, without announcement, she raised the marker and began to write, her movements precise, deliberate, each line placed with clarity rather than speed, and at first the audience did not react, unsure of what they were seeing, unsure of whether this was confidence or simply an attempt to keep up. But within seconds, subtle shifts began to ripple through the room, a few heads tilting, a few brows narrowing, as those paying closer attention started to recognize the pattern forming on the board, not random, not uncertain, but structured, intentional. And Daniel's expression changed almost imperceptibly, the easy confidence in his smile tightening as he leaned forward slightly, trying to follow her logic, trying to anticipate where she was going. And Emma continued, her voice calm as she spoke, not to impress, not to perform, but to explain. "The assumption here," she said, tapping lightly against one section of the projection, "is that these variables operate independently." She paused briefly, allowing the words to settle. "But they do not." Her marker moved again, connecting points, adjusting values, revealing relationships that had been overlooked, and a quiet murmur spread through a section of the audience. Not laughter this time, but recognition, the kind that came when something familiar was suddenly seen from a different angle. And Daniel shifted his stance, his arms uncrossing as he stepped closer, his voice cutting in with a hint of urgency masked as curiosity. "That is an interesting perspective," he said, "but it oversimplifies the constraints we discussed earlier." And Emma turned her head slightly toward him, not defensive, not dismissive, simply acknowledging. "It would," she replied evenly, "if those constraints were accurate." And the words landed with a subtle weight that did not need to be raised to be felt. And for the first time, Daniel did not respond immediately, his gaze flicking briefly toward the screen, then back to her, as if recalculating, as if something small but significant had shifted just beyond his control. And Emma continued, completing the sequence with a final adjustment, then stepping back, just enough to allow the full structure to be seen. And the room once filled with quiet expectation, fell into a deeper stillness, not imposed, not forced, but natural, as if everyone had collectively reached the same realization at the same moment. And somewhere in the front rows, a man who had spoken earlier in the evening leaned forward, his expression no longer amused but focused. And a woman beside him exchanged a glance that carried a different kind of understanding, and Daniel Whitmore stood there, just a few feet away, the space between him and Emma no longer defined by control, but by something else entirely, something he had not planned for, something he could not easily redirect. And for a brief second, as the lights continued to shine and the cameras continued to record, the room did not look to him for what came next, it looked to her, and in that quiet shift, the balance had already begun to turn. For a moment, no one spoke, not because they were unsure what had just happened, but because they were trying to understand how it had happened so quickly, how something that was meant to be simple entertainment had shifted into something far more precise, far more controlled, and Daniel Whitmore felt it before anyone else said a word, that subtle but undeniable change in the room. The way attention no longer orbited around him but lingered on the woman standing just a step away, and he cleared his throat lightly, the sound almost too deliberate, as he stepped forward again, reclaiming physical space even as the narrative quietly resisted him. "That is a compelling interpretation," he said, his tone measured, carefully neutral, though the edges of his confidence no longer carried the same effortless ease. "But interpretations are not always practical in real-world execution," he continued, turning slightly toward the audience as if to anchor them back into his rhythm. "This model has been validated repeatedly by professionals with decades of experience." And there it was again, the subtle return to authority, to hierarchy, to the idea that expertise could only exist within certain boundaries, and a few heads nodded, not fully convinced, but still responsive to the familiar structure, and Emma listened without interruption, her posture unchanged, her hands now resting lightly at her sides as if she had already said what needed to be said. And when Daniel finished, she did not rush to respond, allowing a brief silence to settle, not uncomfortable, but intentional, the kind that made people lean in rather than look away. And then she spoke, her voice calm, steady. "Validation depends on the assumptions you choose to accept," she said, her eyes moving briefly toward the screen before returning to him. "And if those assumptions are incomplete, the results will always appear stable, even when they are not." The words were simple, but the clarity behind them carried weight, and somewhere in the second row, one of the earlier panelists shifted forward, his expression tightening with concentration as he studied the board again, and Daniel's jaw set slightly, a small reaction that might have gone unnoticed if not for the cameras capturing every detail. And he responded quickly this time, as if speed might restore control. "Are you suggesting that every expert in this field has overlooked something that you have identified in a matter of seconds?" The question was sharper now, less playful, more direct, and the audience felt it, the shift from performance to challenge, and Emma met it without hesitation. "I am suggesting that perspective matters," she replied. "And sometimes the person who is not expected to see the pattern is the one who notices what everyone else has learned to ignore." Another pause followed, longer this time, and it was not filled with laughter or commentary, but with thought, with quiet recalculation, and Daniel glanced briefly toward the panelists seated off to the side, as if seeking reinforcement. But what he found instead were faces no longer relaxed, no longer amused, but focused, attentive, and that was when it became clear, not through any dramatic declaration, but through the absence of noise, that the room was no longer waiting for him to guide the moment forward. It was waiting for her. And in that stillness, something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be undone with a quick remark or a practiced smile. And for the first time that evening, Daniel Whitmore did not immediately know what to say next. The silence stretched just long enough to become undeniable, not awkward, not forced, but heavy with a realization that was slowly settling across the room. And Daniel Whitmore felt it pressing against him from every direction, the subtle shift in attention, the quiet withdrawal of certainty that had once fueled his every word. And for a brief second, he looked at Emma Carter not as a participant, not as a segment in his show, but as something he had not accounted for, something he could not easily categorize. and he adjusted his stance again, drawing in a controlled breath before speaking. "All right," he said, his tone steadier now, though stripped of its earlier edge. "Let us assume for a moment that your perspective highlights a gap." He gestured toward the screen. Reclaiming the structure of the conversation, how would you address it in a practical, measurable way? The question was sharper, more focused, an attempt to reframe the moment into something he could manage, something grounded in execution rather than interpretation, and the audience leaned in again, not with amusement this time, but with genuine interest, waiting to see if what she had revealed could extend beyond observation into solution. And Emma turned back to the board, her gaze moving across the adjustments she had made. And for a brief moment she did not speak, allowing the silence to hold its place, allowing the weight of the question to settle fully before responding. And then she lifted the marker once more, her movements as calm as before, but now carrying a quiet authority that no one had expected at the beginning of the evening. "You do not start by forcing the model to behave differently," she said, her voice even, measured. "You start by asking why it behaves the way it does." She added a small notation, connecting two variables that had previously been treated as separate. These inputs are not independent drivers. They are reactions to the same underlying condition. And as she spoke, the structure on the screen began to shift again, not dramatically, not with unnecessary complexity, but with a clarity that made the previous version feel incomplete. And a low murmur moved through the audience, this time not from confusion, but from recognition, the kind that comes when something suddenly makes more sense than it did before. And one of the panelists leaned toward another, whispering something that carried a tone of quiet surprise, and Daniel watched closely, his eyes moving between Emma and the display, his earlier certainty now replaced with something more analytical, more cautious. "And how would you test that assumption?" he asked, his voice no longer carrying the same dominance, but still searching for structure, for control, and Emma did not hesitate. "You isolate the response patterns over time," she replied. "Not just in peak scenarios, but in the moments most people ignore, the small fluctuations that reveal the true behavior of the system." She paused briefly, letting the idea settle. "Because stability is often just the absence of attention." And the words landed with a quiet impact that rippled across the room. And for a second, no one moved, no one spoke, the weight of the explanation hanging in the air. And Daniel's expression shifted again, not dramatically, but enough to reveal that something had changed beneath the surface, something he could not easily dismiss. And he glanced once more toward the panel, but this time he did not find reassurance, only focused attention. And when he looked back at Emma, there was no easy remark waiting, no quick pivot to regain the moment, only the quiet understanding that the conversation was no longer his to control. And as the lights continued to shine and the cameras continued to capture every detail, the room did not feel like a stage anymore. It felt like a turning point. And in that stillness, the authority he had relied on all evening began to fade, replaced by something far more difficult to challenge, something rooted not in status, but in clarity. And for the first time, Daniel Whitmore was not leading the conversation. He was trying to keep up with it. The shift was no longer subtle. It was undeniable, woven into the way the audience sat forward instead of leaning back, into the way the panelists exchanged looks that carried quiet acknowledgement rather than polite detachment. And Daniel Whitmore stood at the center of it, feeling the weight of a moment that was no longer responding to his cues, no longer shaped by his timing. And for a brief second, he allowed the silence to exist without interruption, his gaze fixed on the board where Emma Carter's adjustments had transformed the entire framework. And then he spoke again, slower this time, more deliberate. "You are proposing a structural reconsideration of the model," he said, choosing his words carefully, as if precision might restore authority. "But models like this are not theoretical exercises. They are built on years of field data, real-world application, measurable outcomes." He paused, letting the statement anchor itself. "So if what you are suggesting is valid, it would mean that not just one assumption, but an entire methodology requires re-examination." The implication was clear, the scale of her claim framed as something almost unreasonable, something too large to accept easily, and a few members of the audience shifted, not in disagreement, but in contemplation, weighing the idea against everything they had heard before. and Emma listened without interruption, her expression calm, her posture unchanged, and when she responded, her voice did not rise to match the magnitude of the statement. It remained steady, grounded. Not re-examination, she said. Refinement. The word landed softly, but with intention. Because the structure is not wrong, it is incomplete. She turned slightly toward the screen, her hand lifting just enough to indicate the connection she had drawn. You are measuring outcomes without fully accounting for the forces that shape them. And the clarity of her explanation did not challenge the existing system. It expanded it, and that difference, subtle as it was, shifted the tone of the room again, from resistance to recognition. And one of the senior panelists, a man who had remained silent until now, leaned forward, his voice cutting through the quiet. What would you call that underlying condition? He asked, not dismissive, not skeptical, but genuinely engaged. And the question itself marked a turning point, because it was no longer directed through Daniel. It was directed to her, and Emma turned slightly toward him, acknowledging without shifting her composure. Adaptive response bias, she answered, the term precise, unfamiliar to some, but immediately understood by those who recognized its implications, and a ripple moved through the panel, subtle but unmistakable. As a few exchanged quick glances, their expressions sharpening, and Daniel felt it again. That shift, deeper now, more established, and he stepped forward slightly, not to interrupt, but to remain part of the moment. That is not a standard classification, he said, though his tone carried less certainty than before, and Emma nodded once. It is not widely used, she replied, because it requires long-term observation, and most systems prioritize immediate stability over long-term accuracy. And the words settled into the room with a quiet weight that no one rushed to dismiss. And somewhere near the back, a woman who had been taking notes paused, her pen hovering above the page. As she looked up, and Daniel glanced briefly toward the audience, then back to Emma, and for the first time, there was no hint of performance left in his expression, only focus, only the recognition that the moment he had initiated had evolved into something he could no longer control. And as the cameras continued to capture every second, the room did not feel like a place of entertainment anymore. It felt like a place of realization, and in that realization, the balance of power had already shifted beyond recovery. The air in the room had changed completely, not with noise, not with reaction, but with something far more powerful, the absence of dismissal, the absence of laughter, the absence of certainty from the one person who had once controlled every second of the stage. And Daniel Whitmore stood there, just a step away from Emma Carter, no longer directing the moment, but standing inside it. And for a brief second, he looked at the panel again, not for validation this time, but for orientation, as if trying to understand where the ground had shifted. And what he saw was not resistance, not skepticism, but attention, focused and deliberate. And that was when he understood this was no longer a performance. This was no longer something he could reshape with tone or timing. And he turned back to Emma, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier edge. If what you are describing is accurate, he said, choosing each word carefully, then it changes how decisions are interpreted, not just how they are made. And the statement hung in the air, no longer a challenge, but an acknowledgement, and Emma met his gaze without hesitation, her expression steady. It does, she replied, because it shifts the focus from control to understanding. And the simplicity of her answer carried more weight than any elaborate explanation. And for a moment, Daniel did not respond, not because he could not, but because there was nothing left to reduce, nothing left to frame in a way that would return the moment to him. And the room felt it, that quiet recognition, that irreversible shift, and somewhere near the front, one of the panelists slowly nodded, not dramatically, not for show, but in agreement, and another leaned forward, studying the board again with renewed focus, as if seeing something they had missed for years. And Daniel took a small step back, not consciously surrendering space, but adjusting to a position he had not occupied before, one where he was no longer the center. And he glanced briefly toward the audience, then back to Emma, and for the first time, there was no performance left in his posture, only presence, only attention, and he spoke again, his voice lower, more grounded. Why has this not been addressed before? He asked. Not as a test, not as a challenge, but as a genuine question. And Emma paused for just a moment, her eyes moving across the room, taking in the faces, the silence, the shift, before answering. Because people tend to trust what works, she said. And they stop questioning it once it becomes familiar, she added, her voice calm, unhurried. But familiarity is not the same as accuracy. And the words settled into the room with a quiet finality, and no one moved to interrupt. No one rushed to respond, because there was nothing left to argue, only something to understand. And Daniel Whitmore stood there, the same man who had built a career on control, on precision, on knowing exactly how every moment would unfold, now facing a reality he had not predicted. And in that stillness, with the lights still shining and the cameras still recording, the entire room seemed to recognize the same thing at once, that the moment he had intended to define had instead revealed something far greater, something that could not be undone or reframed. And as the silence deepened, it was no longer empty. It was complete, the kind of silence that does not wait for the next line, because it already knows the truth has been spoken. And in that silence, everything had changed. No one applauded, not because the moment lacked impact, but because applause would have broken something that felt too precise to interrupt, too complete to reduce to noise. And the silence remained, steady and unshaken, as Daniel Whitmore stood at the center of the stage, no longer the architect of the moment, but its witness, his posture still composed, but the certainty that once defined him now replaced with something quieter, something more reflective. And he looked at Emma Carter not with challenge, not with calculation, but with recognition, the kind that comes when assumptions quietly collapse without resistance. And for a brief second, he seemed to consider saying something, perhaps returning to the rhythm he had mastered for years, but nothing came, because there was nothing left to reshape, nothing left to redirect. And instead, he gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but genuine, a gesture that carried more weight than any words he could have chosen. And Emma did not react with triumph, did not acknowledge the shift with expression or movement. She simply stood there, calm, composed, as she had been from the beginning, her presence unchanged by the outcome, as if the moment had never been about proving anything at all. And somewhere in the audience, a single person exhaled softly, followed by another, the sound subtle but collective, like a room releasing tension it had not realized it was holding. And the panelists remained still, their attention no longer divided, their focus anchored on the board, on the explanation, on the clarity that had unfolded without force. And Daniel finally stepped back, not dramatically, not as a gesture, but as a natural adjustment, creating space where it had not existed before. And in doing so, he acknowledged what everyone else had already understood, that the moment no longer belonged to him. And as the lights continued to cast their steady glow across the stage, the cameras capturing every detail for an audience far beyond the room, Emma placed the marker gently back on the podium, her movement quiet, unhurried, and without another word, she turned and stepped away from the center, not seeking attention, not waiting for recognition, simply returning to where she had been before. And as she walked, the audience watched, not with amusement, not with curiosity, but with something closer to respect, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be understood. And Daniel remained where he was, his gaze following her for a brief moment before shifting back to the space she had just left. And in that space, there was no longer performance, no longer control, only the lingering presence of a truth that had revealed itself without effort. And as the silence settled into its final form, it became clear to everyone in the room, and to everyone who would later watch the recording, that what had begun as an attempt to diminish someone had ended as a quiet lesson no one would forget, not because it was loud, not because it was dramatic, but because it was undeniable. And that day, without a single raised voice, without a single forceful gesture, the room remembered something it had almost overlooked, that dignity does not announce itself, it reveals itself. And when it does, the only appropriate response is silence.